Thank you, John. It's really, really the first time for me to have a sustained, conversation both, with the students, but also you and Jeff about, really 25 years of work. And it also kind of comes at a juncture in our practice where we've really kind of moved from kind of doing lots and lots and lots of competitions and losing them to finally doing projects, completing a project for the tower, and I'm hopeful that this last competition that we won will get materialized. So it comes at a very important kind of juncture for us, for both myself and Nanako, to have this kind of interrogation and this kind of discussion. Because I sort of feel like a certain certain sense of the project we've been pursuing has ended, and I'm hopeful that a new one will begin. So it's a great moment to kind of look back at this work and understand what strands we might, have, having criticism from the outside, what strands might be advanced and what should be sort of put to bed, so to speak. So anyway, I want to basically do a fairly straightforward kind of survey of the recent work. The first project is our 014 tower. It's going to be covered in as much depth as I can bring it tomorrow. So I'm going to rush through 014, just give you a taste of it, and then move on to a radically different scale of work, the vector wall, which was a commission as part of the home delivery show at the Museum of Modern Art about a year and a half ago. And then on to Shenzhen Airport. And then finally, I'm going to be showing our competition proposal that we just won in Taipei. So, 4 projects. I hope take too long. I hope I won't bore you. So let's begin. This was taken, I suppose, about 8-10 months ago. The building is now complete. But, 014 Tower was commissioned right after a competition that we entered in Dubai for an 84-story tower, mixed-use tower. We competed against Rem Koolhaas, Zaha Hadid, Tom Main, and the young developer who administered the competition through Dubai Properties asked us to do a proposal for what at that point was a 22-story mixed-use tower, also in Business Bay, which was where our competition project was, where ultimately, Zaha won that competition for the Dancing Towers. Ours is right across the creek from the Dancing Tower site. But it was also the first time that in a real way we engaged a project team and in a way assembled a culture around the project that wasn't a locally based thing. This, I would argue, what is the new local? It's more about shared interest and expertise than it is about any kind of territory. And since Dubai more or less represents a kind of strange non-place, in a way it's appropriate that much of the input in the project would come, as it were, from the outside. So you probably all know the rapid growth of Dubai from 91 to 2005. This is a view of Sheikh Zayed Road, which is more or less the main drag in Dubai, which parallels the coast. It's a very, still very much hugs the coastline, and there's a very kind of humid microclimate that's connected to the waters of the Gulf. And as soon as you go a few kilometers inland, it becomes quite arid, desert. But you all kind of more or less the kind of iconic images of Dubai, the Palm Islands and the World Islands. All of those things were highly publicized. And the kind of development strategy that went on up until the crash last year, creating zones that were highly themed, which came from master planners. This was done by Halcro, which is a kind of British-based firm. We called it a kind of view of hell. And in that, this was an early rendering. The central circular site is where the dancing towers were to have been constructed. So it started out as some kind of a central fountain, and then they figured they wanted an 84-story mixed-use building that at once would be iconic, but at the same time would have a hotel and offices and a massive shopping mall to round things off. But Dubai, at some level, isn't so dissimilar from a lot of the new cities. And so our approach was not so much to be site-specific, but simply to deal with, in a very kind of direct way, what to do in this kind of no-place place that seems to be kind of popping up all over the Middle East and the East. And so it was really instructive to see Rem Koolhaas's solution to the problem. And I mean, basically, it's a question of the kind of demand now. The developer demand, at least at that point, was to create iconic buildings for every project. And so, of course, the urban consequences of that was an extreme kind of heterogeneity of the skyline. Rem's solution was to, in a sense, invert, the modernist sort of model, whereas, Mies inserted the pure prism into a 19th century context as a way of distinguishing himself. His pure prism, I guess, was supposed to kind of be a foil and a kind of spectacular one that rotated against what he saw as rampant formal excess. In fact, this collage incorporates one of the projects that I collaborated on for New York City, for Ground Zero with United Architects, with all of my buddies, because he thought that was probably the closest thing to what we would be producing. So he was trying to kind of preempt the proposal. We started thinking through, some other way of understanding, in the grossest sense, the building relative to sky. I mean, it seemed to us that there was sort of a standard way of developing off of horizon and producing a kind of building on the skyline. And we, in a sense, wanted to affiliate the building more with what was around it. I mean, not the buildings necessarily, but that there would be a kind of artificial nature to the building that would link it more, like in this picture, to the sky than it would be to the horizon or ground. And so I'm kind of rushing through this. I mean, there's a lot more in terms of process that'll open up tomorrow. But once all of the kind of structural and environmental necessities were addressed, we still had quite a bit of freedom in terms of how we would begin to manipulate the shell, the exoskeleton shell of this building. So we went through many, many iterations of that, many of which really dealt more with a kind of relationship to painterly issues than to the purely functional issues which were already there. And we were looking at the building from a number of scales. I mean, another issue was, of course, the diagonal fenestration and its effect in the office spaces. One of the things that was really important to us was to kind of engage the building not only in the kind of distant horizon, but in the very close-up experience within the space itself. And because the shell of the building stands a meter away from the glazing, you have a kind of vista that allows oblique views both down and up. And it's also because of the modulation of the openings, you get these kind of snapshots, you could say. There isn't a continuous view, but it doesn't adhere either to the horizontal kind of curtain wall, nor to the kind of vertical, regular vertical fenestration that more or less aligns with, two different notions of horizon or figure. And so that was something that, was really exciting. And we were thinking through it more or less, theoretically, but it really actually worked in experience. And this is a view of the from the top of the building, looking out at this structural exoskeleton when it's free of the floor slabs. So there were also issues, related to how we would address the site. There were requirements for podia in the project, and also the peculiar relationship of the site to the water. So we conceived of the building as a kind of gateway to the waterfront esplanade. So contrary to the normative way of working here, we were able to convince the developer to take parking out of the podium, which is the norm, to put it underground, because it was a valuable site that he could get more rent for. And then to also open up the ground level as well, not to build all the way to ground, but to really super elevate the podium, higher than Lever House, to really make that an open space where one could not only move through, but you could also expand into from one of the ground floor restaurants. And then there was also the opportunity to take advantage of the podium top. And this was really something that came about as a result of a short-lived redesign of this development by Rem Koolhaas, who suggested that kind of continuity. So our building kind of stands as one that adheres to Rem's program of the open public space on the top of the podium, although our neighbors are apparently, not following that at all. So it's, kind of an ideological project now. But the project itself kind of came about in a funny way. The tall building on the right was our proposal in the earlier competition for an 84-story building. And I'm not going to go too much into it, but basically it's a kind of coming together of two different types of kind of fused towers at the bottom with a slab building at the top. The slab building housed hotel and residential, and then the towers below were for offices. So it was a mixed-use building. The competition organizer, Shahab Lutfi, really loved the scheme, and he wanted it to kind of be replicated in a tower a quarter of the size, a 22-story building. So we went through something like 16 or 17 iterations attempting to kind of answer that demand. But obviously with the drop in scale, it was impossible to do that. So we then moved to a simpler form. It was, at this point, the building was still a mixed-use building. There was residential at, first, half of it more or less was residential duplexes, and those were to occupy the deep parts of the cruciform at the top, and then it sort of swelled out to house the office space below. As things developed there, the mixed-use function was eliminated. It became all 22 stories of offices, but the cruciform remained as the plan form. So it was a vestige in a way. There was also a moment of crisis at that point. I should go back. Because at the beginning, we were dealing with a more conventional column and slab structure. And we were trying to concentrate on the facade and the geometry of the facade. It became incredibly expensive to deal with the curtain wall, given the scale of building. And so we shifted, we had a kind of crisis, stopped the project, rethought it, simplified the volume, and went to an exoskeleton scheme instead. And I'm going to show tomorrow some of the other misstarts in this process, because it actually was a fairly elaborate series of moves that allowed us to go from one model to the next. But anyway, it occupies the creek edge, and we were interested in experimenting with the way the building kind of worked as well at night, how it would be illuminated, and also the possibility of really doing something different with the office floor. We were talking earlier today with some of the students, and one of the things that seems to be a kind of an inertia in office planning is the idea that you have to kind of produce a fairly rigid grid of space, which in a way comes from what offices formerly had to contain. The kind of massive amounts of paper files and so forth. In talking with the developer, he agreed that we could really kind of go away from the grid model, that instead of organizing and sort of striating the space, or gridding the space in order to fill it out for offices, that we could have a much looser arrangement. And he didn't mind the idea that we could have the offices arranged more or less according to the gradients of light and dark, the changing facade, rather than a uniform curtain wall. So the plan actually became quite simple. It's a kind of a soft cruciform. The cruciform shape was also important. It was important that it be rounded because we couldn't have any sharp discontinuities in the shell. Otherwise, it really wouldn't work as a shell. So it's unlike, for example, buildings that may appear formally similar, like the Ito projects or some other projects, where they start with a typological base, which is more of a kind of extruded sharp prism, and then apply a pattern to it. In this one, we really kind of went from the other direction. It more comes from the lineage, kind of looking retrospectively at the kind of organicism of some of Frank Lloyd Wright's early towers, like the St. Mark's Tower. I'm not advancing. There we go. I think this is an animation which will probably not work. What? Let's see. Yeah. Well, anyway, it sort of dramatizes the kind of move from internal structure to exoskeleton. But the building is basically, 22 floors of office space, and then a podium base. The podium, though, is linked at 2 levels to the internal areas of the tower. And those were some of actually the most interesting spaces to work with, because the internal wells and also the bridges produced a really interesting kind of spatial deformation, from the kind of contained box to this kind of continuous ribbon of surface that flows into the tower. And having established an initial pattern, this is the unrolled facade, there was a question about how to connect this fairly asymmetrical diagrid to the slabs. So each of those horizontal lines are connection points. There was, and I'll go into this more in depth tomorrow, but we deliberately made the diagrid out of phase with the floor slab heights. And that meant you had many more asymmetrical conditions in terms of connection. You couldn't look up and see all the way, because it wasn't kind of matching the grid. But it also really defeated a reading of height in the building because of that. And kind of a nice byproduct of the exoskeleton being a meter away, connected only by these very slender tabs, was the chimney effect, which actually kind of saved about 30% cooling costs for the building. So we have an animation that basically shows how that works. Very graphic. Construction started about 2 years ago. And, there was also a learning curve in the construction of the building as well. We worked with a New York engineer, Israel Sinek, who incidentally was both Nanako and my structures professor at Cooper Union. And, is that mine? No, not mine, okay. He is very well known for kind of developer-driven buildings, towers in New York, and gambling casinos and so forth. Did the Trump Tower and the Lipstick Building structure. But he also had a prior experience during the 50s in Cuba with thin shell concrete. And so he was really excited to take this project on as well, because it was sort of a departure from the kind of the hard-nosed development in New York. This was equally hard-nosed in Dubai, but it was driven more by iconic values than by simply kind of the dollars and cents. So it gave us freedom. But they experimented with how the rebar would be woven through the structure, and also when and how to place the foam formwork, which ultimately would be sandwiched between inside and outside steel shuttering, and then filled with a very liquid mix of concrete. So this is an early shot of the lobby space, showing the arcade. And I'll be getting, again, into more detail on this tomorrow. The view of it from the Sheikh's racetrack, and a view, looking down Dubai Creek. And that blank space on the other side of the creek is the site of Zaha's future tower. So we're going to be facing off across the creek. The building is very nearly, well, it's basically complete. The tenants are moving in. It's one of the only buildings that's kind of being occupied at the moment. But here you can see the arcade space and then the lobby recessed. Okay, let me go on to Eon 2. Kind of following on 014, we were commissioned by the same developer to do a 44-story tower. Again, we wanted to explore some of the issues from the first Eon project. And here, we actually were concentrating less on structure per se, but more on how to articulate the surface of the building and how to deal with basically repetition of the same kind of sunscreening element and how it then would react with a more complex surface geometry. So there was a very simple kind of component which was exactly the same. It was fixed. There was a fixture that also mounted it at exactly the same angle. So what causes the variability is the change in the geometry of the edge of the slab. So all of the fixtures are normal to the slab, and then you get a very close reading of the changes of surface because of that. But the panels themselves are in different lights become either opaque or when backlit become more or less transparent. So it's like looking through a set of solar shades basically from within. And so yeah, from the atlas, kind of idea that quantity has a quality all its own. Was it Lenin? Oh, I better correct that. It was Stalin. And we did, some large-scale mock-ups. And one of the early renderings of this. This, unfortunately, the project was a sort of fatality of the crash, so we only got up to the beginning of design development with it before it expired, but we're hopeful it may start up again. But again, here are some details of the principle of the fixture. That it's basically tied to the slab edge, has some shock absorbers to deal with wind, but it's basically fixed at exactly the same angle. Or the piece of hardware is exactly the same, a changing angle relative to the slab edge. And this model was built by a maniacal model maker in Japan who does models for Toyo Ito. He kind of sleeps in an oxygen capsule and for about 3 hours a night and only takes the models he wants to do. He lives kind of in a little room. It was fantastic. So it was all done remotely. It was a man after my own heart. So. And dropping down in scale, the vector wall project, which, as I mentioned, was commissioned by Barry Bergdahl for his home delivery show, which was more or less a history of 20th century prefab. And so the assignment was to take a piece of standardized material and, in his words, to deal with it in a non-standard way. So we started experimenting with manual cutting and some laser cutting. And the idea was to kind of heavily perforate a piece of thin steel sheet and then to give it flexibility to have it become a freestanding wall. Just by making cuts in the surface and then pulling on the surface. So we looked at expanded metal lath first as a kind of more or less generic way of producing openness, but obviously because the pattern, the alternating pattern is so regular, all you get is an expansion in a very kind of uniform way of the surface when you pull on it. But then we started to deal with, and I hate using these words, but we changed the parameter, a few parameters. The length and the angle, once they're changed, suddenly allows you to acquire 3 dimensions and spacing as well. So, with a fairly simple set of basic rules, we could really play. And all of the work was done, through drawing and then a lot of physical models. There was no way of really emulating, at least for us, the behavior of the sheet metal in bending. We tried to do that in the computer and failed. So it was much easier to do it with physical models. And then there was a question of how one would, in a sense, scale up the forces and set up, kind of routines for pulling on the sheet. Ultimately, we couldn't pull it. We actually had to kind of pry open all of those openings. But presumably, one could do in-plane pulling and get these forms. And then we went to some initial prototypes in kind of 1/16 inch thick mild steel. This was still one of the tests. And then on to the final pattern. We realized, and this came up today as well, that we couldn't have this thing acquire its sort of form out of a rectilinear sheet. It had to be patterned and then connected back together, like a clothing pattern. So it kind of resonates with maybe with some of the work that Heather Roberge is doing in her studio. And then we also played with illuminating the piece as well, having it trap different colored lights. And Jeff is disapproving of this series of experiments, is making faces. And then on to, the kind of fabrication of the full-scale piece, which was powder-coated and then connected together. I mean, there was the other dimension of this was to kind of demonstrate that these ideas of prefab didn't have to follow the kind of very kind of Puritan routines of prefabricated houses that you saw in the 20th century, that it would be nice to open up some aspect of sensuality in the project and not to see them as purely kind of extensions of the machine for living model. So appropriately, they placed this next to it wasn't a Charlie Chaplin film, it was the Buster Keaton film. And this is the image which I think Jeff aptly labeled the necessary squandering of labor. It took longer to do this relatively small piece than to design 014. So there was no correlation between the scale of the work and the ambition. So yeah, I'm going to Terminal 3 Shenzhen, which was a competition held, about 2 years ago. And interesting competition in that we weren't, and none of the competitors were asked to design an airport. This was only about designing the envelope for an airport. As a matter of fact, the designer of the airport is a graduate of here who moved to China. It's a woman architect who practices out of Shenzhen. So she more or less kind of framed her design around, I think, one of Foster's airports, especially, I guess, Hong Kong. But it was felt that other architects should attend to the envelope. And so we were selected for an office, Kisho Kurokawa, Foster, and who else is missing? There was a German kind of airport firm as well, who I always forget. Anyway, we were selected from a long short list of about 40 architects down, to the small group, and given 4 months to do the proposal. So it's a fantastic case study, I think, and in the ways that contemporary architects are addressing the issue of envelope. I'm not going to show their schemes. But Jeff does, yeah. But ours, in a sense, was an extension of 014, obviously the Holy Project, but now turning that model on its side and also opening up, the kind of the spatial possibilities for a shell-like building. But we also had to conform to the vault, the models of kind of for vaulting of the concourses, and how to resolve the spanning and the kind of the open spaces, the collector spaces in the main terminal. So it was the first time that we also had to really confront the issue of the column. And I think that became thematic to readings. Each of the architects were faced more or less with a given column grid below the structure. And I think it was an 18-meter grid. We chose to skip every other column point and alternate them. And in doing so, and I don't know if I have the plan maybe back, but anyway, it allowed a kind of echeloning of the columns and the funneling of space towards the central zone of the project. So they became kind of ways of kind of sucking people towards the center by kind of alternating the columns and also inclining them, gave you more of a sense of that pull. So that was really important. And we came up with two different ways of building the building. We really weren't trying to be kind of structural or material purists. So we actually had a concrete scheme and a steel scheme for the same project. And it was more about how to develop the surfaces in space rather than just focusing in on the materials. Unfortunately, in the course of this competition, it narrowed down to us and Fuchsas, and it also apparently was it was sort of polarized between the planning authority in China, who wanted to explore new concrete, long-span concrete, which hadn't really been dealt with since the early 60s. And then the Fuchsas scheme, which was a steel scheme. So we were instructed not to present the steel proposal and only to present concrete. So this kind of, these are diagrams showing the kind of the lower shuttering, the introduction of the same sort of foam pills that form void forms in most of the structure, and then also are knocked out. All the blue ones are sort of knockouts for fenestration. So you can see here the kind of the incline of the columns, and also moments where you really don't have, you have more of a salience off the surface than a true column, at the entry. But it was really an interesting project for me in terms of the return to the column, because most of the long span structures we experimented with in the 90s in a speculative way, we tried to make as column free as possible and just have the soaring roof. But actually, in doing this, I was more and more convinced that that kind of modulation in the space was really, really important. We also kind of did one better in terms of how to do with the geometry of the openings. So in 014, all of the openings are perpendicular. Here we were thinking through a way of having a much thinner shell actually illuminate itself. So the oblique cuts would block much of the light, but they would catch light and bounce light in the shell, so it would glow. And it would also produce a kind of dapple pattern at the top of the vault. You can see the buildup here. A kind of almost a virtual effect of form, and although it's actually a completely uniform vault, but there are apparent bulges because of that distortion. You get very strange effects because of that. And then at another set of logics down at the gates where it's more like a kind of a rhythm of angles that allow you to see the airplane from a certain distance on the travelator. So we kind of intersected a little bit the optical project. And this is the connection, the kind of nexus point where we had to reinforce with ribs. So the comparison between the steel and the concrete. The cladding on the outside was also kind of simplified. In other words, we didn't fit to the concrete. There was an outer layer of cladding, which 90% of which was completely uniform in terms of the opening. And then the opening changed shape in the concrete or in the, kind of in the construction behind it. So that kind of simplified construction. So you can see here the more or less uniform glazing and cladding units, and then what happens behind them. Yeah, and this was what I was talking about the travelator views. And here's the kind of notional idea of the kind of transformation of one side of the grid and keeping the other side regular. And then the uniformity of the actual uniformity of the thickness. And then the regular exterior glazing and cladding that goes on. And then we further went into exercises with different fritting densities for sun screening. And there were all kinds of terrible experiments made at Arup trying to kind of work with the lighting levels, which I honestly couldn't tell one from the other. And then attempts to optimize the number of customized openings as well. Reduce the number, yeah, simplify. Make it as simple as it can be. So the project is actually nearly a kilometer long, and it incorporated, not only international and national flights within China, but there was also demand for green roof system that they wanted over the parking area, and a landscape which basically kind of dealt with the runoff from the green roof. So we created a garden in front. Okay. And then this is the animation. we had to deal with all the boring spaces underneath as well. So there was a whole demand for kind of for media and information in the spaces that were given, and an account of all of the ways through the airport. So this is a radically shortened version of the animation we had to do. Yeah. Again, it took longer to produce the film than to do the design. It took months, you know. It was all in-house, so. But they wanted every path through the airport for both national and international use coming and going. So this is last project I'll be showing. I just came out of it a week ago, so it is as new to me as to you in a way. But it was a competition that was held this past fall. The finalists were Studio Gang and Office Da and us. So. Sorry? Yeah. And there was a call for, as part of an overall program by the mayor of Taipei. Last year's project was the Performing Arts Center that was won by Rem Koolhaas. And the jury decided to go for another generation, a younger generation of firms, which was very kind of fortunate for us and all Americans, which I'm not sure why. But anyway, the Taiwanese music industry has existed fairly independent of any kind of government control. They were really influential in East Asian pop, but they've always felt themselves to be fairly marginalized within Taiwan. And now they're facing, of course, the upsurge of Mandarin pop from the mainland, and of all of the kind of downloading and bootlegging that's going on. So the government decided to kind of come in and really formalize a relationship with the music industry and to create a physical place that would allow not only performance, but also the development of new music and new performers and bands and so forth. So this center is not actually the biggest venue for pop music. If you really want to have a major concert, you go to the stadium. It's actually considered a kind of middle scale place for performance and really for the music industry to come together. So it ranges here from small clubs to an auditorium for 3,500 people, and then finally to an outdoor performance space, which would be for about 14,000 people. And so we felt strongly that it had to really become, in a sense, part of Taipei, but also should separate itself out from the context. So the initial and kind of big move I think that we made was really to lift the whole project up, and I'll get into that in a second. Basically the project is a kind of modified circus. There's a big plinth which essentially connects the two major parts of the site. It's a very long linear section, and then also a smaller section, which is where the theater could be placed. So it's kind of a square site next to a very long linear site. And so we decided to bridge over the road to make a kind of make of it a landscape and kind of infrastructural piece, and then to concentrate on three major object buildings. So this cross section actually shows the main auditorium, and also we decided not to make the office building a separate building, but to actually consider that office tower a very special office tower in that it was to house the music industry. So it's part of the back of house of the theater. And the idea is that there would really be much more kind of direct connection between those people and the artists within the building rather than separating them out. So it's a kind of, some people have said that it looks like a super extended fly tower. But the other part of it was to kind of create this strange instability in the building. Rather than having it melt into the podium, it's almost like one of those seals where the bottom nearly separates itself from its base. It kind of touches very lightly on the ground and kind of lifts over the podium. So yeah, this is a kind of basic view of the site. It's a new development area in the far west of Taipei, and it's more or less centered between two railroad stations. So there will be flows of people moving from both north and south coming out of those stations, as well as people coming by automobile and by motorcycle. It's an industrial area now, and it's going to be completely reclaimed. And the idea was that this elevated public ground would function as, in a huge venue that could be flexible. And it could change according to the scale of the crowds and the uses. So not only a place for music performances, which have their own sort of period here, especially the outdoor ones, but it could also become an urban space. It could be used for green markets and night markets and so forth. It would be, a part of the city, but also kind of detached, to have a kind of a new horizon over the city. So this is the longitudinal section. The cube on the left is the Hall of Fame. And so the face of it is eroded, and they're seating, a very steep seating in the face of the Hall of Fame. And on the far right is the the frame for the most extended kind of version of the stage. The brief asked for that, enormous dimension for the stage, and we thought it was kind of ridiculous to make that a fixed frame because it only really was necessary in concerts probably once a month at most. And so our idea was to make that a traveling platform and a traveling stage. It would actually change geometry and scale. And it would ultimately move towards the Hall of Fame and actually kiss it. This was another idea about borrowed landscape, that when you were in the bowl of this circus form, you would lose the middle ground, and you'd see the hills beyond. So it was an interesting kind of space to be in. But basically, it is a very simple sort of typological idea. You start with the stadium, which is sort of centrally focused. The circus has multiple foci. It's this kind of stretched stadium. We then opened up the ends, allowed kind of access, and then extended that sockle or podium across the road and connected. Sorry? Yeah, it's Cardiff. It's the, rebirth. So we didn't obviously want it to be a kind of closed place like the Paris Opera, but that there would be a kind of graded set of public to, front of house spaces in this. And that it was really important also that the building be visible. I mean, that the whole complex be visible through media. It's as important as, seeing it as being there in a certain sense. Also, we, were particularly interested in various ways of dealing with the iconic. We didn't really want a fixed icon for this. There was a real demand for what the icon would be. And so that rather than kind of fixing the Hall of Fame, especially with one, it would be a changeable one, that media would be kind of projected on the face of that, and whoever was the person of the moment or being advertised would acquire the icon. And so, I was thinking of Madonna too, who in a way is not known for any fixed state of her career, but is known as the one who changes. To kind of somehow deal with that as a model rather than kind of fixing on an iconic model. And also that in some weird way connects to Central Park and the idea that, Olmsted could not have anticipated the functions in the park, but he created the conditions for those things to occur without really knowing what they would mean culturally, or in the crudest way, that you would have certain things possible in the big open spaces versus the more intense sort of folded spaces. So what happens in the Rambles is very different from what happens out in the sheep's meadow. But in the kind of crudest sense, one is more about open engagement, the other one is more about, an extremely intimate space. So whether it's 19th century courting or gay trysting for the Rambles, it's actually, there's a similar set of conditions that promote that. Gay trysting. Is that right? Gay trysting. So anyway, the cultural conditions change. And the idea, too, was that the stage would move along tracks. It was very mechanical. And it would also fold up as it moved down the tracks. And that you would be able to, in a sense, have different scales of crowds use the circus and the bowl of the circus on one side, but there would also be the possibility of extending the public space behind it. So that, what? And crushed, yeah. So, at the ground level, there was, kind of continuous retail space, in the underside of the whole thing. So it maintained the kind of streetscape as well. And then commercial then bleeds up into the project also. So it's, as much a piece of urban design and the ambitions as it is a specific building design. And the other part of this is that we were required to build only 25% of the space. So much of the building is actually earthwork. It's not, that, it's still construction, but it's not considered to be figured into the site coverage. And it could also be understood as, part of an extension of the green space around it. So it layers up in a fairly kind of direct way from the retail and the live houses, the small clubs, which occupy the kind of the realm of the street, to the middle scale of the plaza, and finally to the kind of uppermost level of the surface, where you have the outdoor amphitheater. And that amphitheater, goes more or less from zero up to finally up to 2 levels. So there's a gentle incline in the surface, towards the stage or towards the north end of the site. So this existing site, the excavation of the parking, the build-up, and the movement of the soil. We're basically not moving much of the soil from the excavation off the site, which is apparently a very good thing in terms of the green issues, but resculpting it. So it's 8 to 12 meters above grade. So you have the theater in its most extended form facing the Hall of Fame cube, and then the theater kind of moves on tracks. It can become a kind of attraction, a kind of different kind of icon for the sort of piazza in front of the main hall, or it can kiss the cube, in which case you get a very intense kind of vertical space, and then this is in its most extended form. So when it kisses the cube, there are all the rollouts for the Hall of Fame and or for single performers and so forth. And then obviously we were kind of arguing for the different users in the site at various times, from the green markets to the restaurants to the live houses to the public performances. And then we also went through the exercise of looking at what happens over the course of 2 weeks, which we figured was the kind of period of time between two major 14,000 person outdoor events. So we kind of put forward a provisional schedule, meaning that the place wouldn't be a dead place in the city. And then the same thing was kind of diagrammed over a year's time. So all of the kind of possible events that could unfold in this place, including all of the marginal events around it. So the idea too was that it would actually have an effect on the neighborhood as well, and be a kind of analogous to a Hollywood. And the other thing that we were paying very close attention to was the issue of the kind of makeup of the surface. And this was really an extension of some of the concerns we had in the earlier project in Taiwan, where we wanted to make, basically a grassed surface, also for acoustical reasons, but to deal with different gradients of density of paving from the most external parts of the project, where you see on the far right, it's really beyond the area of the main stage. So that's both a parking lot, but also could be used as a drive-in theater, or could be used for events or uses that would need hardscape. And that then gradated into the fully grass space in the main bowl. And this would be a kind of daytime use. And to look at all of those, again, all of the kind of edge zones for the project. So, using it as a drive-in or using it for amusement parks. I was actually talking to a producer here, Yael Evelev, spoke about, who works with David Byrne, spoke about what happens at Brooklyn Academy of Music. And it's really about, not just about the kind of nominal functions of the place, but about all of the sort of side events that happen around BAM that really make it viable. And then there was a whole kind of interest in bringing kind of native plants and agriculture to the site, so worked with tea and rice around the main hall. And apparently a lot of artists are doing this in Taiwan as well. I was always honestly a little bit uncomfortable with this kind of direction in terms of the use of landscape, but apparently, they're very passionate about kind of connecting to what they think are kind of primordial modes. But we connected that to kind of the ecological issues, the cooling of the building as well. So the water from the rice ponds actually substitutes for chillers. So this is a view from under that podium at the road level, and then a view of this, the traveling stage when it's in front of the main hall. And yeah, basically the kind of gradient of scales of performance as this robot travels. And I think we have an animation, I hope. It may not run. Oh, maybe. Will I get lucky? No. Well, you won't see the robot transform, I'm sorry to say. But it was sold in principle, it works like an umbrella. The main members telescope, and then they act on an external set of kind of flexible joints as trusses, which are then covered by an open kind of stretchable skin. And then, went through all of the various, kinds of uses for daytime concert, nighttime concert. The uses of the stage at the mid position, where you could conceivably have a market on one side and then an audience on another. The live houses, which are really small clubs that are, again, connected more to the underbelly of this place, to the street. And then in its most sort of compressed form, when the kind of crystal kisses the cube, the Hall of Fame inductions and small indoor concerts. We also moved some of the live houses into the main hall for kind of older people who weren't interested in the kind of club scene. They would be more like fancy nightclubs as well. So the whole project is actually connected together. All of the elements are connected by kind of a net structure that contains lighting and also sun shading, because people in Taiwan don't want to go out into the sun directly. So this net spans to the Hall of Fame and then also to the main hall. And then there are LEDs at each of the kind of crossing points of the net. And one of the ideas about this net also is that it could actually be warped and changed according to the kind of direction of the sun in the daytime. And this is a view actually without the net, looking from the Hall of Fame towards the expanded theater. And here you can really see the kind of erosion of the kind of face of the cube with all the seating pedals. And then behind it are the galleries. There's the Hall of Fame, a series of exhibition galleries, a small lecture hall, and then finally at the top there's a kind of restaurant and lounge that gives you access to the topmost sort of box seats, so you could look out at the whole space. It's a view from kind of looking down from within. And of the kind of experimenting with the LED illumination of the cube. And yeah, the kind of views from within from both within the Hall of Fame seating, but also from various audience positions, depending upon the location of the stage. In the auditorium, the main auditorium space. This is going to undergo revision as well. We're kind of moving towards a flat floor and reducing the number of people. It was really over-designed. And one of the things, I mean, in terms of quantity, one of the things that they were looking at as a kind of safety measure was to include Broadway shows in the Pop Hall, which is a kind of difficult compromise in terms of functions, but I think there's some anxiety from within the government as to, you know, how the place will be financed. So they wanted that kind of flexibility. But it actually is very large for a Broadway show also. I mean, it's really much too large for that. So this is going to, I'm sure, undergo a lot of revision in terms of its scale and scope, you know, as we move forward. Yeah, I'll go quickly through the on-site reuse of fill. And then there were experiments made which were really interesting by the Arab people who are, you know, actually do lighting and sets for pop concerts. So they kind of use their software and experimented with different lighting arrangements. I'm not advancing. Okay, and this is our final animation. This animation actually doesn't show the simultaneous folding. The other one didn't run here, so it's more fixed.
Does it fold the same way? Like where it is on the track, it folds the same way? If it goes from one end to the other, you can index the location that it folds?
You could change it, I think. I don't think it's, you know, absolutely linked. I mean, it allows you also to change the scale of the stage, so it, you know, it's somewhat independent of that. Thank you.